In the early 1800s, nestled on the outskirts of Dorset, England, stood the Aldermore estate, an imposing manor surrounded by acres of windswept moorland and thick, brooding forests. It was a house that seemed to lean into the shadows, even on the brightest of days. The Aldermore family, a lineage of Old English blood, had occupied the land for generations. Wealthy, educated, and somewhat reclusive, they were known by the townsfolk more for their legacy than their presence. His library, which spanned 2 floors, was said to contain ancient tomes that were banned in other parts of Europe. While many regarded him as eccentric, it was the silent, unnerving demeanor of his wife, Lady Beatrice Aldermore, that left an even deeper impression. She rarely spoke in public and was often seen wandering the gardens long after dusk, her pale dress glowing faintly in the moonlight. Servants whispered stories about her, of séances held in the drawing-room, of strange chanting behind closed doors, but none dared speak openly. The Aldermores bore 5 sons over a span of 12 years. Each child was raised under rigid discipline, with education and obedience being paramount. They were not sent to public schools but taught at home by a series of tutors, most of whom left the manor within months of arriving. Some claimed the boys were too strange, too cold, too quiet. Others hinted at things darker. One tutor, in a letter found years later, wrote of dreams he couldn't explain, of hearing footsteps outside his room at night when the children were asleep, and of seeing Lord Reginald staring at nothing for hours on end, whispering the same name again and again. As the boys grew, so too did the distance between them and the outside world. They were rarely seen in town, and when they did appear, they kept to themselves, their eyes darting nervously, as though wary of something only they could perceive. The eldest, Edward, was said to have an extraordinary gift for music but would only play in the attic, and only when the wind howled loud enough to cover the sound. The second, Thomas, became obsessed with insects, collecting rare species and preserving them in jars lining the west hallway. The third son, Charles, was drawn to astronomy but refused to look at the moon, claiming it watched him back. By the time the 4th and 5th sons, Henry and James, came of age, the estate had already taken on a life of its own. Doors closed without cause. Mirrors fogged in the middle of summer. Family portraits seemed to shift when no one was watching. To the outside world, the Aldermores were a family of mystery and intellect, strange, yes, but grounded in wealth and influence. But within the estate walls, there was tension. Death hovered like a permanent guest, and with it, an unspoken fear that the lineage was cursed. The family rarely spoke of the future. There were no plans for marriage, no aspirations beyond the estate grounds. Time seemed to loop in on itself, with each day echoing the last, a slow, suffocating descent into silence. It was around this time that the first tragedy struck. Edward, the eldest, just days after his 21st birthday, was found lifeless in the bell tower, the very tower no one could remember building. His death was ruled an accident, though no one could determine how or why he had been up there. The remaining brothers were shaken, but Lord Reginald seemed almost expectant. He refused to hold a funeral, citing unseen matters that had not yet concluded. From then on, something within the manor shifted. The hallways grew colder. The servants left in growing numbers. And though 4 sons remained, it became clear that the Aldermore legacy was not one of prosperity, but of inevitable sorrow. Edward Aldermore was the firstborn son of Lord Reginald and Lady Beatrice, and from the beginning, he was considered the pride of the Aldermore family. He was a quiet, introspective boy with pale features and dark eyes that always seemed to be searching for something just beyond view. From a young age, he demonstrated a natural affinity for music. He would often disappear for hours, only to be found in the attic room with a small, dust-covered harpsichord that no one remembered purchasing. He never learned from a teacher, he simply played, his fingers moving effortlessly over the keys, producing melodies that were eerily beautiful and unlike anything his parents recognized. As Edward grew older, his presence in the manor took on a ghost-like quality. He would glide silently through the corridors, often barefoot, and speak only when spoken to. The servant said he was polite, but distant, as though his mind was elsewhere. He rarely joined his brothers in their lessons or their sparse playtime. Instead, he spent most of his time in isolation, writing strange symbols in his notebooks and composing pieces of music that he never allowed anyone to hear. The only person he spoke to with any frequency was his mother, Lady Beatrice, and their conversations were always behind closed doors, often accompanied by the scent of burning herbs and the faint sound of chanting. On his 21st birthday, Edward did not come down for the family supper. This in itself was not unusual. The Aldermore children often kept to themselves, and Lord Reginald was not one to tolerate disruption to routine. However, when his absence extended into the next day, concern began to stir. His room was found undisturbed, his bed neatly made, but his shoes were gone. A search began across the estate, with the groundskeepers and remaining staff checking the surrounding fields, gardens, and wooded paths. No sign of Edward was found. It was on the third day that one of the gardeners noticed something strange about the old bell tower at the edge of the estate. Though rarely used and long believed to be locked, a faint, persistent chiming had been heard during the night, echoing across the moor. The family had always dismissed the structure, its origins were unclear, and no official documents marked its construction. Most assumed it had been added by an earlier generation, then forgotten. Yet the gardener swore he saw movement in one of the narrow windows. Upon investigating, the family discovered that the tower door was not locked, merely stuck from years of disuse. Inside, the air was thick with dust and a scent like damp parchment. The staircase wound tightly upward, lit only by slits in the stone walls. At the top of the tower, beneath the massive bronze bell, they found Edward. He was seated upright, legs crossed, his hands resting on his knees as if in meditation. His eyes were closed, his skin cold to the touch. There were no signs of injury, no indications of struggle or illness. A small, leather-bound journal lay beside him, but most of the pages were blank except for one, a line written in his delicate hand that read, "The hour comes again." The family doctor, summoned immediately, could not determine a cause of death. His heart had simply stopped, he claimed, as though Edward had chosen to exit life in that very moment. Lord Reginald forbade any mention of the event in public. No obituary was posted. No funeral held. The body was interred in a private corner of the estate cemetery, without ceremony. The bell in the tower was never rung again. In the days that followed, strange phenomena were reported by the staff. Whispers in the hallways where no one stood. Sudden drafts in sealed rooms. The sound of piano keys being pressed softly at night, despite the harpsichord remaining untouched in the attic. One maid swore she saw Edward walking down the west hallway at dusk, only for him to vanish when she turned the corner. Within the family, Edward's death cast a silent but heavy shadow. His brothers, especially Thomas and Charles, began to withdraw even further. Lady Beatrice fell into a state of deep melancholy, refusing to eat for days at a time. She spent long hours in Edward's attic room, sitting in the dark, her hands resting gently on the closed harpsichord. Lord Reginald, though outwardly composed, began to isolate himself as well, retreating into his study with books so old their titles had faded from the covers. He spoke less and less to his remaining sons, as if his paternal responsibilities had ended with Edward. Questions about why Edward had gone to the tower were never answered. Some believed he had been drawn there by his own mind, by a longing for solitude or silence. Others thought differently. A few of the remaining staff whispered of a pattern, of something far more sinister beginning to unfold. Something connected not to Edward's life, but to the number that marked its end. After Edward's death, an uneasy silence took hold of the Aldermore estate. The wind through the moors seemed colder, the walls of the manor somehow heavier. Life did not return to normal, rather, it settled into something stranger. The remaining brothers, Thomas, Charles, Henry, and James, each retreated into themselves, but it was Thomas, the second eldest, who began to show signs that something more was at work than grief. He stopped eating meals with the family and spent increasing amounts of time in the conservatory, where he bred and studied insects. What began as a childhood hobby turned into a full-blown obsession. Thomas catalogued every beetle, moth, and spider he found on the grounds, pinning them to velvet boards with such precision that the servants joked he was embalming them for some secret ritual. Charles, the middle child, became consumed by the stars. He spent his nights at the top of the west wing, peering through a brass telescope that had once belonged to his great-uncle. But unlike most budding astronomers, Charles wasn't interested in planets or constellations. He kept detailed notes on lunar behavior, often sketching phases of the moon accompanied by cryptic comments like unblinking, same place, or circle returns. He often referred to something he called the Watcher's Arc, a term found nowhere in any known scientific text. Charles refused to speak to anyone about what he was observing, and when asked, he would simply reply, "You wouldn't understand unless you've heard it." It was Henry, the second youngest, who began to show more visible signs of fear. He refused to sleep in his own room after Edward's death and insisted that his window be nailed shut, claiming he had seen Edward standing outside on the lawn, motionless and staring up at the house. When confronted by Lord Reginald about his irrational behavior, Henry broke down, sobbing that he would be next, that the house was picking them off. His mother, Lady Beatrice, rather than scold him, seemed to take his side, offering no comfort but only a knowing glance that suggested she, too, suspected something was wrong. The maids often found her standing in the main hallway late at night, facing the front door, as though waiting for someone to come through it. James, the youngest, became almost completely mute. Once a cheerful and talkative child, he barely spoke a word following Edward's death. He communicated only by writing in a leather notebook he kept with him at all times. When asked what was wrong, he would only write, "The bell. I hear it," even though the bell tower had long been sealed. He took to drawing strange spiral patterns over and over in the margins of the book. The spirals were always the same, tight at the center and growing wider at the edges, drawn in thick, dark lines as though his hand were pushing into the paper with unusual force. As each son reached the age of 21, their behavior intensified. Thomas, days before his own 21st birthday, locked himself in the conservatory for 2 days straight. When the servants broke in, they found him seated on the floor, surrounded by hundreds of preserved insects, arranged in perfect, concentric circles around him. He had drawn symbols on the walls in ink and pinned moths in the shapes of runes none could decipher. The next morning, he was found dead in the study, his body frozen in a posture that mirrored Edward's exactly, arms resting on his knees, eyes closed, with no sign of trauma. A single sentence had been etched into the wooden floor with a razor, "The circle doesn't break." Charles followed 2 years later. As his 21st birthday approached, he stopped eating and refused to leave the observatory. He claimed the moon had changed positions, that it no longer followed natural laws. The night before his birthday, he was last seen standing on the balcony of the West Wing, staring at the sky with his telescope clutched to his chest. In the morning, he was gone. No body was found. Only his telescope remained, placed carefully on the balcony railing, with a page from his journal beside it that read, "I saw what he saw." By now, the surviving family members had begun to draw fearful conclusions. Though Lord Reginald refused to entertain the idea of a pattern or curse, the staff whispered openly about the timing. Each boy had died at the age of 21, each under mysterious and unnatural circumstances, each preceded by erratic and obsessive behavior that seemed to worsen as the date approached. Henry, still shaken by Edward's death and now the loss of Thomas and Charles, grew increasingly paranoid. He refused to be alone, begged to be sent away from the manor, and scratched marks into his bedroom wall that he insisted would keep time at bay. James, meanwhile, no longer wrote in his notebook. He merely stared at the tower. His eyes, once full of curiosity, now held a dull vacancy, as though he, too, was simply waiting. In the wake of the third tragedy, as Charles vanished into the night and left behind only that final, haunting message. The whispers that had once belonged to servants now found voices in the drawing rooms of the Aldermore family themselves. The idea of coincidence, once Lord Reginald's shield against suspicion, was wearing thin. The timing, the symmetry, the eerie consistencies, they were undeniable. 3 sons, each dead or disappeared, each on or just before their 21st birthday, each preceded by periods of obsessive, peculiar behavior. Yet while some still clung to rational explanations, illnesses of the mind, tragic accidents, or the heavy burden of grief, others began to lean into something older, darker, and far less comfortable to name. Among the locals, the legend of a curse took root. The story of the Aldermore son spread beyond the manor grounds into the surrounding village, where superstitions already ran deep. Tales emerged of the land the estate was built upon, an old pagan site, some claimed, with druidic roots or ties to ancient rites long forgotten. Others said Lady Beatrice's bloodline was not noble, but arcane, that her grandmother had been branded a heretic in secret by the church, known to perform rites beneath the roots of hollowed trees. Stories that were once nothing more than rural folklore took on new shape in the shadow of repeated tragedy. Inside the estate, signs of spiritual desperation began to emerge. A locked drawer in Lady Beatrice's private bureau was found to contain small effigies made of twine and bone, placed in protective circles drawn in ash. Several books vanished from the family library, volumes that Lord Reginald had once proudly displayed, now missing without explanation. One of the few remaining housekeepers, who had served the family since Edward's birth, confided to a neighboring vicar that the lady had begun speaking in strange tongues at night, her voice echoing from her room in an unnatural cadence. She also described finding animal remains in the east garden, positioned deliberately, ritualistically. Lord Reginald, however, doubled down on the natural order of things. He held firm to science and theology in equal measure, forbidding any discussion of curses or magic within the household. He sought counsel from physicians, all of whom blamed the deaths on psychological ailments, undiagnosed madness, hereditary melancholia, perhaps even a rare neurological disorder. But no diagnosis explained the sameness of each death, nor the lack of physical cause. Nor could they explain why every doctor, without exception, left the estate as quickly as they arrived, often citing sleepless nights and an overwhelming sense of dread that permeated the manor walls. Despite Lord Reginald's resistance, Lady Beatrice embraced the idea of something more than medicine or coincidence. She began holding late-night meetings with a woman known only as Agnes, a figure shrouded in mystery who came to the estate under cover of darkness and left before dawn. Some believed her to be a medium, others a practitioner of forgotten rites. What was certain is that her presence coincided with the growing intensity of strange occurrences, books falling off shelves with no provocation, clocks stopping precisely at 11:11, and the sound of footsteps on the 3rd floor when it stood entirely empty. As Henry approached his 21st birthday, his paranoia reached fever pitch. He refused to sleep indoors, choosing instead to stay in the stables, surrounding himself with oil lamps and binding his arms with rope before bed so that it couldn't move him. He spoke often of shadows that whispered, of Edward's voice calling him from beneath the floorboards, and of Thomas's preserved insects reappearing in strange places. In his final week, Henry scratched a pattern into the walls of the barn, a spiral of words repeating the phrase, "Not mine, not mine, not mine," in uneven, trembling lines. The night before his birthday, he was found hanging from the rafters, a look of calm etched onto his face that disturbed even the local coroner. What made his death most unsettling was the complete absence of struggle. The knot was expertly tied, the floor beneath untouched. He had left no note, only his spiral-covered walls and a single line written in the dust on the stable window, "4 down. 1 sees." James, the youngest and final son, was now alone. The house, once filled with the echo of young voices and restless footsteps, had grown intolerably silent. Lady Beatrice ceased leaving her chambers altogether. Lord Reginald took to drinking heavily, and the estate began to decay at the edges, paint peeled from the once grand staircase, the gardens went untended, and the servants left one by one. James, by contrast, became still. He did not cry, did not rage, did not resist. He simply sat by the window each day, staring at the bell tower. When asked what he was doing, he would respond only with the same phrase, repeated like a mantra, waiting for the pattern to complete. The discovery of Edward's journal after his death had been a moment of brief interest, dismissed almost as quickly as it was found. A small, leather-bound book with mostly blank pages, it had held only one legible line, "The hour comes again." At the time, it was seen as a cryptic final thought, the kind of dramatic flourish often attributed to a troubled young mind. But as the years passed and more of the Aldermore sons died in similarly inexplicable circumstances, those within the estate began to revisit the journals, letters, and drawings each son had left behind. What once seemed like isolated eccentricities began to look eerily consistent. Patterns emerged, phrases repeated, symbols echoed, a rhythm to the madness that none had noticed until too late. It was Lady Beatrice who first gathered the fragments. Alone in her chambers, she collected the notebooks, loose-leaf sketches, and scattered letters that her sons had abandoned in their final days. She pinned them across the walls of her sitting room, stringing red thread between recurring words and shapes. She read and reread every entry, especially the ones penned in those final weeks before each son turned 21. Her chambers, once a space of delicate silks and quiet refinement, transformed into something closer to a cryptic archive, filled with candlelight and the rustle of aging paper. Each son had documented their descent differently, but there were commonalities that could not be ignored. Edward had written about dreams, vivid and recurring, always set in the bell tower. He described a voice he could never quite place, a slow tolling that echoed through his bones, and an overwhelming sense that he was being called somewhere just beyond the edge of waking. Thomas, though consumed with his insects, had written passages about order and symmetry. He described the movement of beetles forming shapes he had not arranged, of waking to find new patterns etched into the condensation of his windows. One particular page in his journal featured a detailed diagram of concentric rings, with the words, "unbroken, always 5, scrawled beneath. Charles's entries were perhaps the most difficult to interpret. His notes on lunar patterns and celestial anomalies read more like the ravings of a prophet than an amateur astronomer. He wrote of alignments that hadn't occurred in recorded history and used phrases like, "the sky's pupil," and "inverted orbits." Some of his later drawings included images of the manor itself, but always seen from above, surrounded by swirling spiral shapes and dotted with small excess that appeared in different positions on each sketch, as if moving with time. He never explained what these excess represented. Henry's journal, found in the days after his death, was perhaps the most direct. In nearly every entry, he begged not to be taken. He wrote about the sound of footsteps that came only at night, about being frozen in bed while shadows moved across the ceiling. He referenced Edward and Thomas repeatedly, claiming they had spoken to him in whispers, warning him that resistance only delayed what was coming. In one of his last entries, he wrote, "It waits until we see it. Then it waits for us to speak. Then it chooses." At the bottom of that page was a symbol, a crude spiral with a dot at its center, encircled by 4 uneven lines. James, the final son, was the least prolific writer of them all, but what he did produce was chilling in its simplicity. His notebook was filled with pages of the same phrase written over and over, "Not me yet. Not me yet. Not me yet." But toward the end, that phrase changed. A single entry stood out, dated just 3 days before his 21st birthday. It read, "I know its name, but if I say it, I will hear the bell." That sentence was followed by rows of slashes, carefully counted and grouped in 5s, like someone tracking days in a cell. James's notebook abruptly ended after that page. No further writing was found. Aside from the journals, the house itself began revealing strange details. Hidden behind a false wall in the library, an old chest was found containing pages that predated the current generation. These included letters from an Aldermore ancestor who referenced the burden of the 5th line and a price demanded in 21 years. There were faded diagrams, more spirals, more unnamed stars, passages written in Latin and Greek, some torn or burned beyond recognition. The oldest document among them was a parchment with a single sentence written in trembling ink: "When the fifth awakens, silence will fall." Even the architecture of the manor began to seem suspect. One of the servants noticed that from above, the layout of the estate, its wings, garden paths, and even the placement of the bell tower, mirrored the very spiral symbols drawn in the son's journals. The realization spread a quiet terror among those still residing on the grounds, as if the estate itself had been designed not to house a family, but to fulfill a purpose no one living could remember. After James passed his 21st birthday, the estate fell into a kind of hush that went beyond silence. It was not the quiet of mourning or the stillness of a family at rest, it was the silence of something completed. James was found seated in the bell tower just as Edward had been, his body untouched, his eyes closed, his hands resting neatly on his knees. No sign of violence, no indication of fear or struggle. A single page lay beside him with the words, "The pattern has been fulfilled," followed by a final spiral drawn in thick, inked lines. The page was signed, though the name did not belong to James, or any member of the Aldermore family. The signature read, "I.A." After James's death, Lord Reginald was never seen in public again. Rumors spread that he had taken ill, or gone mad, or perhaps simply refused to live in a world where none of his sons remained. But those who still worked on the estate told a different story. They said he remained in the tower for days after the body was removed, refusing to speak, eat, or sleep. When he finally descended, he walked slowly, with a faraway look in his eyes, and locked himself in the study. From that point on, the door never opened again, and his meals were left outside until they, too, stopped being collected. No one knows precisely when he died. Lady Beatrice vanished entirely. No record exists of her death, no grave was ever marked. Some said she fled to the north with Agnes, the mysterious woman who had once visited under moonlight. Others believed she had simply disappeared into the manor itself, consumed by whatever force had shadowed her family for decades. Her rooms were found empty, save for the wall covered in her son's writings, now stripped bare, the threads gone, the symbols scratched away. In the center of the room, carved into the floor beneath the rug, was the spiral once drawn by Henry and echoed in every brother's journal. A single candle had burned itself out on the windowsill. What became of the estate after the final death is a story clouded in confusion. The property was never officially sold, yet records show that ownership quietly changed hands multiple times over the next decade. Each new owner spent a short amount of time there before leaving abruptly. Some never even moved in. One man, a solicitor from London, reportedly set foot in the manor only once. He spent just 43 minutes inside before fleeing the premises without a word and refusing to ever speak of the visit again. The house soon developed a reputation, not just as haunted, but cursed, an architectural riddle that swallowed generations. Eventually, the manor was abandoned. The gardens overgrew. The windows shattered. Nature began to reclaim the structure, vines snaking up the stone walls, roots lifting tiles from the floor. Yet those who came near the estate, hikers, thrill-seekers, paranormal investigators, often reported an overwhelming sense of unease long before reaching the front steps. Equipment malfunctioned. Phones went dead. Watches stopped, all at exactly 11:11. The bell tower, still intact, was said to emit a soft chime at midnight, though no bell had existed inside for years. The spiral symbol, once hidden in journals and sketches, began appearing carved into trees near the estate, drawn on rocks, scratched into doorways. Of all the stories that surfaced in the years that followed, the most disturbing came from a local schoolteacher who had taken a group of students on a nature walk near the Aldermore grounds. One of the children, a boy of 10, wandered off the path and was found standing in front of the manor gate, staring at the building. When asked what he was doing, he replied calmly, "I used to live here. I'm just waiting for them to call me back." He had never been to the manor before and had no known connection to the family. Inside the crumbling estate, no furniture remained. No portraits. No remnants of the Aldermore name. But in the bell tower, carved into the wood beneath the bell's former hanging point, were the initials of each son, EA, TA, CA, HA, and JA. Below them, a sixth set of initials had been freshly added, though no one could determine by whom. The letters simply read, IA. Scholars who later examined the documents left behind by the Aldermore family noted that the curse, or force, seemed tied not to madness or bloodline alone, but to the very concept of completion. 5 brothers. 5 deaths. 21 years. A cycle closed. Yet that final signature, IA, suggested something deeper, something ongoing. It was as if the pattern had not ended with the last son, but had merely paused, waiting once more for the conditions to align. Waiting for another name to be written. Waiting for the bell to ring again. B6.